All right, thank you very much, Brad. Thanks everyone for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be here. If I seem a little tired today, it's because I am. I was up quite late doing this and a full day of branch planning with the new budget and with the government, and it's been a long day, but we'll get through it. Keith had asked me to touch on sort of the impacts of I think initially you just suggested early springs, but I included late falls, warm winters, and early springs, and then I have some other updates near the end of the presentation as well. The whole presentation kind of revolves around just changing climates, changing conditions. With beekeeping, I think things are becoming more and more common that we're seeing these late seasons, these early springs, and kind of these wonky winters. So that can have impacts on the colonies, and it can have impact on management strategies as well. Just generally the impact of all those things. I'll touch on just some emerging pests, just give you a little update on two pests, small hive beetle and tropolalaps, and then some other brief updates at the end. So first off, when we're kind of talking about these changing conditions and changing falls and springs and winters, it's important to look at just kind of what happens in a normal setting. So I think you've probably all seen versions of this graph before. This is from Randy Oliver's website, scientificbeekeeping.com. Basically, he took Lloyd Harris's data that he collected in the 70s, kind of adapted it. I think he stayed up for 3 days, whatever, typing all his data into his own spreadsheet and then making up kind of a fancier version of this graph. It's sort of complicated to look at, especially if you've never seen it, so we won't kind of delve into too much detail about it, but in general, this is just kind of the population kind of dynamics over the whole season. So if you kind of follow, the top of the line is just the total population of bees in the hive. So this is January, I guess kind of mid-December, just before January here. And a smaller population. Obviously things dip off in the springtime with spring dwindle, and then things kind of skyrocket up and hopefully peak around the main honey flow peak. And then kind of drop off and then slowly kind of taper off over the fall. The different colors on here just represent, so Lloyd Harris kind of painstakingly went through colonies and marked thousands of bees over the course of many weeks. And so these are the different cohorts of bees. So the red bees, if this works, are the bees in there from 0 to 12 days of age, 13 to 24 days of age in yellow or orange, and then the yellower shades there, 25 to 36 days, 37 to 48 days, and so on. You get older as you go into the winter, and those winter bees are actually living longer throughout the winter, all the way up to about 217 to 252 days. Just in this particular experiment, but this is in Manitoba, so this is sort of what we might expect under normal conditions, although this was back in the 70s, but I think it's very much still applicable. The black dotted line here is just the amount of brood in the colony. So obviously brood peaks in the spring, kind of also peaks higher in the summer, and then tapers off and kind of slowly tapers off in the fall time as well. Virtually in this experiment, almost no brood in November, but then definitely a little bit of brood over the winter. And I think a lot of people think that there's never any brood in the hives over the winter. I think Lloyd has shown that usually there is at least a little bit of brood. Different genetics would have different impacts on that, different populations. There'd be different factors that would influence that, but I think in general there will be a little bit of brood produced over the winter. If we just kind of block out that section, we'll just kind of focus mostly on basically from peak honey flow until kind of the fall here. And we'll just kind of touch on the factors that impact the actual production of winter bees going into winter. So as things change in the fall time, as the amount of daylight decreases and the temperature drops, both of those things impact the population dynamic in there, influences the production of winter bees. So the bees shift from those summer bees that live only 6 to 8 weeks into bees that can survive much, much longer. And so there's these many different factors, so daylight and temperature, as well as diminishing pollen resources as things stop flowering in the fall time. The pollen resources go down, there's diminished foraging, and that also in turn, all of this kind of influences the amount of brood production within the colony, and the queen obviously slows down her laying. There's also much less brood pheromone, which sends signals to the foragers to stop foraging as well. So these kind of end up with this kind of cyclical thing where things start to influence each other, and the colony just really shuts down for the fall. So with the production of winter bees, so all these factors, what happens with the winter bees is that you have a reduction in juvenile hormone. So juvenile hormone is much more prevalent in the adult bees, the older bees in the colony. I think when people think of juvenile, they probably think of the younger bees in the colony, but it's actually the older bees that have this juvenile hormone. So that is vastly reduced. The amount of vitellogenin, which is a special protein produced by the bees, increases dramatically, and that leads to the development of increased fat body on the bees as well, which allows them to survive much longer into the winter, as well as hemolymph proteins and other proteins that are much more prevalent in those winter bees. So if we just think about kind of the population structure, so we have obviously, the much younger bees here, the brood's dropping off, bees are getting much, much older, and so you get these darker colors, and then kind of way into purple and about 250-day-old bees there. With changing climate, so obviously things are changing here, and we don't have to go into a climate change debate here, but I think it's obvious that we're seeing these conditions happening more and more, where we have these later falls, earlier springs, and kind of these weird winters. So in general, the predictions are that these things are going to be more common. We're going to have these longer falls, warmer winters with these kind of weird temperature fluctuations, as well as these earlier springs, and hotter and drier summers as well. So when we look at the impact of warmer and longer falls, so one thing I think we probably all know about is we see these periods of extended brood production. So the queen isn't shutting down as early. This brood is extending much further. I think in 2021, in November, I had 4 frames of brood in some of my colonies. They just lasted way, way longer into the fall. And maybe that's a good thing. You're producing more bees later into the season, but I think that it can have negative impacts as well. First of all, you can have an extended mite production season. Your fall mite treatments aren't going to work as effective with all that brood in the colony. And when you're trying to do things like oxalic acid vaporization in October, and you still have 4 or 5 frames of brood in your colonies, you're going to be having to treat much later as well. With the extended brood production, you also would have decreased ability for that colony to store feed. That brood is just kind of clogging up, getting in the way of where the bees would actually be storing that food. And you'd also have increased food consumption with the amount of brood being produced later into the season. just looking at this study last night from 2023, and so there's a couple studies that I found, pretty recent studies that have tried to model what these changing conditions will look like into the future. And so this study modeled this, I think, quite well, but not perfect, obviously, not based on actual data looking into the hives. So these are our models. But this study found that an increase in the temperature in the fall obviously leads to an increase in flight conducive weather. So the bees are actually out flying more in the fall, but this can also impact the overall population age structure. So it skews the population to more older bees into the fall, which would have implications for the bees going into winter that are much older and not surviving as long, so you basically end up with increased mortality in the spring. So kind of what it does is it shifts these blue colors back this way, so that the bees are aging a lot quicker, and you end up with a lot of these older bees kind of earlier in the fall. And again, this is kind of based on modeling, and I don't think, there's lots of different factors within this. If you have extended brood production later into the fall, maybe that does help a little bit, but if you have, basically if the colonies shut down in October, you get some really cold temperatures, and then you get this crazy 15-degree weather in November, and the colony becomes super active again. I think that can really just kind of mess up that whole age structure going into the winter. Over the winter, as things change and we see these increases in temperature fluctuations, this winter was extremely mild. You can end up with increased brood production if it actually does stimulate the colonies to start laying eggs over the winter, and you have this increased brood production. Again, maybe not the worst thing, but you'll kind of open the door to increased varroa production as well. Increased food consumption, and things like starvation start to become much more of a concern in the springtime. If temperatures really warm up, and maybe this is kind of late winter, maybe not right in the middle of January, but I think in February this year, we had some really warm weather. The bees were probably flying a little bit. Tons of snow out. They can't orient as well. It's still pretty cold. They can't make it back to the colony, so you end up with a lot of bees just dying out in the snow. And then things obviously get cold again, and the colony just has less bees to actually keep itself warm. And then again, as those bees are starting to become more active, and bees are actually leaving the colony, you end up with accelerated age structure again. So those bees are accelerating their aging, which can lead to increased spring dwindling, colony mortality in the spring. So this is basically very similar to what might happen in early spring. So those kind of temperature fluctuations could happen right at the end of winter, or winter, spring, whatever you want to call it. So very similar things: increase in brood production, much earlier increase in varroa production, increase in food consumption, starvation becomes more of a concern, increase in flight activity and some mortality earlier on, accelerated age structures, and increased spring dwindle. So these bees that would otherwise survive much further into March and maybe into April before they really start to dwindle down, if they become much more active in February or in March, they'll start to kind of dwindle maybe way back here. Obviously, as beekeepers, we have an ability to begin our management a little bit earlier, so we can actually get in there, start feeding syrup, start feeding pollen, and start treating for varroa, start actually managing them much earlier. But as we start to manage colonies now, or early April, those colonies are also probably, if temperatures hold, those colonies are going to be increasing their populations And by the time honey production comes around, you'll probably end up with these much stronger colonies going into honey production, which causes more issues for things like swarming. If you have these huge populations and dandelions stop blooming and there's a dearth period with a really large population, you may want to keep a really close watchful eye on starvation at that point, monitor the feed levels a little bit more. And then as well, and I think we saw this in 2021, and so this whole presentation is sort of a bit of a reminder of what happened a couple of years ago, is a lot of beekeepers actually put in their mite strips much earlier than usual. In there for 6 to 8 weeks, those mite strips come out, but they're coming out a lot earlier than they normally otherwise would. And you have this kind of period after treatment, but it's still a little ways to honey production where the mites have a larger opportunity. You basically just shifted things earlier, but that honey flow maybe doesn't shift, maybe it does, but you have kind of this post-treatment period where I think we really need to be a little bit more mindful at that point of what's actually going on in the colonies, not only dearth, but in terms of varroa as well. It's extremely important, and I know I always remind you guys of this, to monitor after treatments. I think it's much more important to remind you of that now with apivar concerns and resistance concerns with apivar. So if you're using apivar this spring, if you have it in already, when you pull it out, I think just be sure you're sampling after, make sure it worked, look at your levels then, kind of assess how much time you have until the honey flow, assess what treatments may still be an option before the honey flow, or even think about some of the formic acid treatments during the honey flow. HopGuard is also registered during the honey flow as well. So I think those things just really need to keep in mind, and particularly varroa. So it's not all a doom and gloom, I don't think. I think there's a lot of things we can think about to kind of mitigate these changing climates and changing impacts. One thing, and maybe this isn't accessible for everybody, but indoor wintering can help just keep that temperature constant throughout the winter, and the bees aren't as vulnerable to those big spikes. And if things really kind of taper down in a more normal fashion, you get those bees into your overwintering sheds. If things do spike again in the fall, at least they're kind of in your shed and they're not as susceptible to those spikes in temperature. Wintering strong colonies with sufficient food stores, both syrup and pollen. So wintering strong colonies, obviously very important. Strong colonies also are more thrifty, I guess, with the amount of food that they consume. So you would think a strong colony might consume more food, and maybe they do, but on a per bee kind of basis, they're able to hold that temperature a lot better than a smaller colony. They're not as susceptible to those temperature swings, and so they can be a little more thrifty with those food stores. But as we mentioned at the beginning, there is usually a little bit of brood produced over the winter as well. If you do have some frames of pollen in there, it'd be much more likely that there will be a little bit of brood produced over the winter. I know the Canadian Honey Council Best Management Practices Guide, I think, advocates for about 3 frames of pollen. If they're available, if you have extra pollen frames around at the end of the season after honey extraction, it wouldn't hurt just to have a couple pollen frames in there over the winter. Controlling varroa early, so and basically year-round, but these viruses that come with varroa can actually impact the honeybee, the winter bee physiology. So protecting not only against varroa, but specifically against the viruses that come with varroa is extremely important. So thinking about controlling varroa as soon as you come out of the honey flow, and making sure those bees that are coming out of the brood and going to be your winter bee population are less exposed to virus as much as possible. Wintering young and locally bred queens. So wintering young queens is extremely important for overwinter. Those older queens are much less likely to make it, and the hive is less likely to make it as well. But locally bred queens can be really beneficial. They're locally adapted to those local conditions. I did come across an article last night as well. This was a European study, but the local queens compared to other import queens, I think they lasted about 83 days longer into the spring than these other imported queens. So yeah, just something to keep in mind there as well. And these young queens can build up much earlier and protect against some of that spring dwindle. So as the colony is dwindling, those young queens have a much higher laying capacity and able to build up a lot quicker. And yeah, just kind of throwing this out there, that winter management actually starts in the spring with planning the entire season, planning your early varroa treatments, planning your splitting, planning your queen rearing, just thinking about that whole season that lies ahead, rather than thinking about winter when September comes around. Any kind of burning questions on that? Yeah. Okay.
With the indoor wintering, this year I saw through the YouTubes and stuff that I saw the temperature. Because we had such a warm winter, the temperature inside went higher in some situations than what people could manage.
Right.
What kind of effect would that have on the bees?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it could, cause them to become more active as well. It's similar to an outdoor condition, probably. Maybe not as much. They're probably, protected to some degree inside, but. Yeah, I mean, if you have an indoor wintering building, I know Dr. Curry has years and years more experience than I do with indoor wintering. He always advocates for some type of air conditioning system as well, not only heating, but air conditioning to keep that temperature really, as stable as possible. Yeah, yeah, Waldemar?
You mentioned actually that the stronger hives will actually have some brood in the winter time. But the studies also showed that that brood actually never comes to hatch.
Over the winter?
Yeah. Reason being is actually the colonies use the brood to produce brood food to offset the moisture that they're producing while they're consuming the high amount of food at that moment.
Okay, then that's...
It varies from race to race too.
That would be all the time, kind of a set in stone kind of rule that it doesn't emerge?
So there's nothing set in stone in nature.
Yeah, I know. I always assumed that it would emerge in the colony, but I haven't read that. Yeah, that's news to me. Okay. I just have a few more slides. Maybe I'll finish off and then we'll continue with the question and answer period. Just a couple of kind of brief updates on some of the emerging pests, particularly small hive beetle and Tropolaelaps mite. Everyone knows what small hive beetle is? Raise your hand. Tropolaelaps? Okay, very few know what Tropolaelaps is. So we'll touch on each of these. So small hive beetle, and I guess the reason I'm touching on these is because there's been a lot of attention on these two specifically in Canada and in North America right now. Small hive beetle is basically established in Ontario, other parts of Eastern Canada. It was found in BC last year in about 7 operations. Obviously, some of the Manitoba beekeepers go to BC over the winter, things like blueberry pollination in the springtime. We have 2 out in BC right now that will be coming back in spring. I'm in very close contact with the provincial apiarist in BC. We're kind of monitoring the how well small hive beetle has survived the winter out there. It's really isolated to one general area, very close to the border in the Abbotsford area right now. But that's not to say it isn't going to spread throughout BC. I think it's probably likely that it might establish in BC, but it has popped up there before and has not established, so we don't really know what's going to happen yet. They're just starting their spring inspections in BC right now, so hopefully I'll know a little bit more from the provincial apiarist out there in the coming weeks. In Manitoba, it has been detected here in the past. I think the last detection was 2012 or 2013, so it hasn't been here for at least a decade. Never established here. It was detected, but we were able to do follow-up inspections, quarantine certain areas, never established. But yeah, it very well could. Or maybe our winters will kill it off. But with changing conditions, I think it's very possible that it could establish here. Tropalaeolaps mite is native to Southeast Asia. Comes from the giant honeybee, Apis dorsata. It's now on Apis mellifera, and it's been moving, I don't know if I would say rapidly, but it is spreading around that region, and there's concerns of it coming to North America as well. Small hive beetle, scientific name Athena tumida. Basically, it kind of looks like some other beetles you may see in your hives or in your buildings at times, some dermestid beetles. But one way to distinguish it is it has these very large clubbed antennae. It's roughly about 3 millimeters in width, I think 5 millimeters long. And it has kind of these really short elytra, which are covering the wings, and an exposed abdomen at the bottom there. But the clubbed antenna kind of really give it away. It can be kind of brown or black in appearance. This is just in relation to a bee. You can definitely see it with the naked eye. But the adult beetles lay eggs inside colonies. Those eggs hatch into larvae, and the larvae do basically all the damage in the colony. They consume honey, they consume brood, pollen, they defecate in the hive, they can start fermenting honey inside the colony, basically just make a huge mess. Maybe a similar pest to wax moth, but also quite a bit different. And then after this larval stage, the larva actually goes out of the colony to pupate in the soil. Once it's pupated, the adult comes back into the colony and kind of starts that whole process again. So these are kind of a couple gross pictures. There's much grosser pictures on the internet that I'll let you find. The larval stage actually can be a little bit similar to wax moth. So beekeepers sometimes have a tough time distinguishing the larval stages there, but the small hive beetle larvae have kind of these spikes on the upper side of their body, whereas the wax moth don't. Fairly similar in size, slight differences, but probably the spines would be the best method of seeing which is what. Some management techniques for small hive beetle, just early detection. These import controls are really important. Having these inspections done in other provinces before bees are actually moved into Manitoba, making sure we're not importing it. And on the beekeeper side, just being aware of it, which is part of why I'm making you aware of it now. I think it's definitely within the realm of possibility that we could see it popping up. It can fly as well, so we've had it fly over the border and end up in some southern beekeeping operations close to the US border. Obviously, we have an inspection program here in Manitoba as well, so the inspectors are keeping a very watchful eye for it out there. Reporting, it is within CFIA an immediately reportable disease throughout all of Canada. So if any beekeepers do see it, there is legislation that you need to report it. You can report it to me. I can then pass that on to CFIA. If you see any beetles that you suspect may be small hive beetle, you can just take a picture, send it to me. If I know right away that it's not, I say, don't worry about it. If I think it might be, you can submit a sample to me, or an inspector can pick one up, or whatever, we'll deal with it. Treatments up until this year, Coumaphos was available. Coumaphos is now not registered anymore as of November of last year. So that was really the only real treatment that worked against small hive beetle. So we kind of crossed that one off the list. So there's really no other registered treatments right now for small hive beetle, although there are a whole bunch of trapping, commercially available traps that can be purchased. Some of them are quite cheap. There's kind of these beetle sheets that you can buy that I think are about 5 cents a sheet. Keeping strong colonies also really helps with a lot of different things, but strong colonies can actually remove small hive beetle larvae from the colony. Breeding for hygienic behavior can also really help as well. Recently, there was actually a webinar that Apimondia put on a number of different invasive species. There were, I think, about 3 different presentations on small hive beetle. If you're interested, this is the link right here. Dr. Jamie Ellis gave a presentation there. He's down in Florida. He's dealt with small hive beetle extensively. So just shifting gears here to Tropolaelaps. So as I mentioned, it's an invasive mite species native to Southeast Asia region, originally found on the giant honeybee Apis dorsata. Just in relation to Varroa here, it's quite a bit smaller than Varroa, about 1/3 of the size. There are, I think, about 4 different subspecies of Tropolaelaps. Tropolaelaps mercedisi is the one of most concern. That's the one that's actually moving around that region. So right now it is spreading in Southeast Asia. It's been found in Papua New Guinea and South Korea and different parts of Eurasia, including, we think, Russia and Ukraine. Those are both unconfirmed at the moment, kind of tough to get good information out of that region right now. As we know, we had Ukrainian queens coming into Canada last year. There has been no shipments of Ukrainian queens approved for this year. CFIA is well aware of this situation and has not approved any shipments of Ukrainian queens. The biology is very similar to Varroa, although there are some differences. It reproduces much faster than Varroa. You can get a much larger number of Tropolaelaps mites being reproduced within the brood, within one brood cycle, and a much shorter phoretic phase. So it only really, I think, can survive on adult bees for about 3 days, that we think. There's a lot of unknowns currently at the moment. Samantha Muirhead was part of a large group that actually went to Thailand to help study Tropolaelaps just a few months ago over the winter. And she did a webinar with the Alberta Tech Transfer Program. They've posted that up on YouTube. Just go to YouTube and search for the Alberta Tech Transfer Program. You'll find that quite easily. So she's got a lot more information on it than that I'm presenting tonight. In general, there's a lot not known about it, which is why she went there with this big group to learn what they know about it. Monitoring control, quite similar monitoring to Varroa. You can do alcohol washes, you can use sticky boards, but it's extremely hard to see. I know Samantha said she could not pick it out on a sticky board. I think most of us that use sticky boards know Varroa is hard to see, especially with all the debris on sticky boards. Tropolaelaps is much, much harder to see on sticky boards. Some of the best control strategies are just prevention of importing it in the first place. So having close communication, especially with countries like Australia and New Zealand, which are in close proximity to some of these other Southeast Asian countries. Both those countries are very good about reporting anything to CFIA here. So I think there is a risk of it coming from there, but I think the risk is quite low of actually importing it on packages from Australia or New Zealand, especially knowing the fact that it can't really survive on adult bees for a very long time. But as I mentioned, there's a lot we don't know. I think the mite can probably surprise us in a lot of ways. We know formic acid is quite effective at controlling it. I believe apistan is also effective at controlling it, but I think those are really the only varroa controls that we know are effective on tropolaelaps. So again, just we have lots to learn. There is a North American tropolaelaps mite task force that's been established. There's also a training down in Auburn, at Auburn University this fall, likely for provincial aparists. Maybe some of the inspectors might go down for that training as well. Learn as much as we can about it, and sort of develop a strategy for if it actually does arrive in North America, what we can actually do about it. Just briefly, the last slide here, just some brief updates. 2024 Honeybee Health Treatment Guide. I apologize, I haven't sent it out yet. I've been trying to get it out for the last 2 or 3 weeks. I've been very busy. I've been working with Matthew just this week on some other things related to getting it out, and I promise it'll be out tomorrow. The 2023 guide is virtually the same. Kumafos is kind of knocked off the list, so if you have the 2023 guide, you can obviously just rely on that. Not much else going to be changed. Sertan, so we had the emergency use registration of Sertan, so that was the wax moth control product that was registered last May. It's registered for a period of 1 year. That obviously expires this May, so it is still legally allowed to be sold right now. The provinces are just kind of talking right now, trying to figure out who is for sure wanting to be on the next application. So the company is pursuing full registration of the product, but that is very delayed, so we have to go through another year of emergency use. And so that will be submitted hopefully very soon. It's looking like there might be a little bit of a gap in between those registrations, but you can still buy it now. You just might not be able to buy it until June or something. As I mentioned, Checkmate was canceled. Oxalic acid glycerin, I wanted to mention this tonight just because there's rumblings of beekeepers using this across Canada. Just to reinforce the point that this is not yet a registered methodology for oxalic acid. Vapor treatment is fine, the trickle treatment is fine, but the method of mixing it in glycerin and the extended use application of oxalic glycerin is currently not registered. We don't have Canadian instructions for applying it. I've heard of some beekeepers that used it and had it in all winter and killed all their bees. So don't do it. I will also enforce this point too, that I had a call from Health Canada on Monday morning informing me that they will be doing some inspections in 2024 under their pesticide compliance program, specifically within the beekeeping industry. This is like something way above what I'm, I can't say no to it. This is Health Canada, so they're just informing me that this is going to be done. These will be random inspections within the bee industry. I don't know how many they're going to do. They may not do a ton. I think they're doing all of Western Canada. So just something to keep in mind if you're thinking about something like this. And that is it. Some questions? Yeah, Ian?
So are we going to expect a big black van to pull up and guys?
I don't know exactly. I had an initial conversation with them on Monday. Apparently there's some sort of memorandum of understanding between the provincial government and Health Canada, where if they ask for beekeeper information, we're obligated to provide that to them. They sent me that MOU document on Monday. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I'm going to be sending it up to my superiors to look at it, make sure everything is good before I share any beekeeper information with them. But yeah, I don't know yet exactly what's going to happen. Yeah. Question in the back.
Hold on, I'll come with the mic here.
Thank you. You mentioned two things about the small hive beetle that I wondered if you could comment further on. One
was that perhaps our winters are severe enough that it would eliminate them. But you also mentioned that a small high beetle could fly in from North Dakota or Minnesota. And I'm just wondering if you have information on how prevalent small high beetle is in North Dakota and Minnesota, or whether, you know, the ones that are flying in maybe are just from packages that are imported from Florida, or whether they're established and resident in North Dakota and Minnesota.
Well, I mean, bees move around like crazy in the States. It's established in many regions of the States. So, you know, bees go from Florida to California and then up to North Dakota. So I'm sure there's lots of small high beetle in North Dakota. I don't know exactly how much, but it's definitely there, right on our doorstep. And yeah, I think a single beetle, I'm pretty sure, can fly about 15 kilometers, depending on wind conditions. So they can get over the border. Whether or not a single beetle would be able to establish something in a colony, yeah, not sure. Depends when it arrives and how long it has to start laying eggs and establish. But very likely, especially with outdoor wintering, probably would take care of it. But if you have a colony, maybe the beekeeper didn't, you know, slipped under the radar or whatever, got put into an indoor wintering facility, whatever the case may be, and it could establish. Yeah. Thank you.